What would Kamala Harris' presidency mean to the global community? Would she continue the transatlantic commitment of her current boss, President Joe Biden? What about Ukraine? What about Israel? What about China? What about NATO? There's hardly a better person to address these questions than Ian Bremmer. He's an American political scientist focused on global political risk. Ian, welcome to DW.
Sure, great to see you.
Let's start with Israel, Ian. The support of the Netanyahu government is a huge problem for the Democrats in the United States, as many potential voters in important swing states, such as, for example, Michigan, want a more critical approach. Where do you see Kamala Harris going there?
It's very hard for her to differentiate herself while Biden is president, because she has to be supportive of his policy, and her statements, while they've had different emphasis, have certainly been completely supportive of his policy. I think a President Harris would actually be quite different. I think you would see a lot more pressure on Israel to limit the campaign, or else. I don't think there'd be the blank check that you have seen, in reality, if not in principle, from the Biden-Harris administration over the past 9 months. She is much more concerned about the Palestinian ability to continue to live with basic human conditions on the ground in Gaza, and frankly, in the West Bank. She sees U.S. foreign policy on Israel-Palestine as a failed policy. And I can't see her saying that publicly, but I think that you would see her govern that way. And in that regard, of course, she's much more sympathetic to Palestinian statehood, and especially on the back of the Knesset voting against the two-state solution. So I think she might consider being willing to recognize a Palestinian state even before Israel would accept it. You know that some European countries have already done that. Others are considering it. I think you would find that a Harris administration would be much more aligned with the Europeans on Israel-Palestine than either Biden or Trump. I think that would, in fact, in some ways, it's the most meaningful differentiation between Harris and Biden.
But as you just said, Ian, it will be very hard for her to talk about that during the next 10 weeks or so, but it could be a maker or breaker in the election, could it?
I don't know about that. I mean, Americans do not consider any major foreign policy issue right now to be the top of their agenda. Immigration, inflation, and abortion are all significantly more important than any foreign policy issues that you would ask me about today. Migration, of course, isn't part of foreign policy issue, but for most Americans, it's a domestic issue, which is why it's so important. I do think that in terms of, a swing state like Michigan, where you have a lot of American citizens, voters with background, heritage from the Middle East, and a lot of Muslims that live there, that is a place where Kamala Harris could outperform from Biden, but it will be hard for her to say the sorts of things that would really allow that needle to move.
Well, and then there's, of course, Ukraine. When I'm traveling the US, I hear from more and more Americans who say that the US should cut spending for other countries and do more for its own people. What do you think? Where will Kamala Harris stand in this regard?
I think that fear is overstated. By the way, the $61 billion in military support that the U.S. Congress overwhelmingly and bipartisan approved a few months ago would not have happened if Trump didn't support it. Trump was more than happy to see it drag out, but ultimately he was happy to have it done. And his view is that the Europeans should be spending more on defense for Ukraine and on their own collective defense, but that a Ukrainian self-defense is also in American interest. He's made that very clear. So I don't think that we are facing in a Trump administration or a Harris administration suddenly literally jettisoning support for Ukraine. I don't believe that. But I do understand that the Ukrainians are under pressure. and they're under pressure in part because American support is not quite what it should be, in part because European support is also uncertain going forward. You probably know that the Germans, under fiscal constraints, have just reduced by 50% their own commitments to Ukraine over 2025. We can't talk about the US and Ukraine unless we also bring up Germany. And of course, the fact that the Ukrainians are themselves running out of people. I hate to say this, but I do fear that because the Ukrainians have done such extraordinary things to defend their land over the last 2.5 years, that we in the West, the Germans, the Americans, and others, we have made the Ukrainians out to be superhuman. And it's not right. You know, they're people with passions and with frailties and with weaknesses, and they are, you know, they are facing limits of what they can do. And you know, it is absolutely possible that the Ukrainians will end up losing a lot more because they just can't continue to perform at this level. And I say that about Ukraine's president, too.
That brings me to my next question, Ian. So we experienced during the recent prisoner swap that the US and its allies are willing to negotiate with Vladimir Putin. What would that mean for a Harris administration when it comes to Ukraine, also just regarding what you just talked about?
Well, the Ukrainians don't like the fact that there were secret negotiations involving your country, my country, Poland, other NATO allies for many months with Russia that the Ukrainians literally had no idea was going on. So the Ukrainian perspective will be, well, wait a second. So if they could do that, have they been talking about like the war and not telling us? I mean, you can understand why they'd be worried about that. And, you know, I know that those negotiations have been overwhelmingly about getting this prisoner exchange, and that there's no meaningful movement on negotiations that would involve Russia and Ukraine. But I mean, you know, are we certain that this has never come up in a way that might potentially affect Ukrainian sovereignty? No one can tell you that. No one can tell you that. So I think they're right to be worried, but I also believe that the Ukrainian population themselves are moving to a position where some type of negotiation is becoming more feasible, and where they understand that they can't just continue to fight and fight and fight, even if that means, you know, losing some of their territory. I do believe that the reality of Ukraine is that they will be partitioned. I believe that they will end up losing a significant amount of territory. And what I mean by that is that there will be a significant amount of territory that Russia will continue to occupy for the foreseeable future. And I think that the West and Ukraine are increasingly coming to that reality. And I think that, by the way, that is true for Harris and for Trump. The difference, and this is important, very important for the Europeans, is that Trump is much more willing to engage with the Russians unilaterally. He would be willing to cut a deal on the prisoners or to cut a deal on Ukraine without talking to the Europeans, the NATO allies, and without talking to Ukraine. And Kamala Harris would not be willing to do that. She, like Biden, would want to ensure that this was a consensus policy of the NATO alliance together with the Ukrainians who have agency. Trump's a lot more like Kissinger. You know, Trump, you had a conversation with Kissinger back when he was alive, and he would talk about these great powers as if other countries didn't even exist. He's like, well, here's the deal we're going to make. And of course, that's just not the world we're in today.
You just mentioned NATO. I mean, given Kamala Harris' appearance at the Munich Security Conference, she seems very, very committed to this alliance. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I think that she sees that this alliance is essential to U.S. national security. And she also recognizes that a lot of the problems that we have are global and that you need strong friends and you need to work with those strong friends. So, yeah, she certainly would be interested in seeing these countries continue to spend more. Obama did, Biden did, Trump did. I mean, this is not surprising. And I don't think the 2% figure is written in stone. I think that there is upward pressure on that 2% of GDP spend, even as the European countries are facing higher interest rates and challenging fiscal environments.
There's, of course, China. Do we have any idea how Kamala Harris' policies are and her take on tariffs against them?
Probably the most aligned with the Americans. Remember, she was there with Biden for the APEC summit in San Francisco, her home, California. And she was very active with all of the leaders there, including the Chinese delegation. I think that she probably is most aligned with Biden on China policy. This is a place where she wants to see more promotion of American strategic industries with allies, is worried about intellectual property theft, is worried about the lack of rule of law, is worried about Chinese subsidies. So this has been a more consensus-oriented policy between Biden and Trump, Republicans and Democrats. She would not be interested in, across the board tariffs that Trump is talking about, but she'd be more focused on expanding, advanced technology constraints against the Chinese in a way that Trump hasn't really focused on that.
We hardly talk about that, but that's something I'm really interested in. The more than 2 months between election day and the inauguration of the elected president is always really a time of uncertainty. I think, especially in this climate where it's very likely that Donald Trump might actually not accept a loss.
It is completely certain that he will not accept a loss. And if it is close, we have a very serious problem. This is going to be the worst election and post-election environment that we have seen in our lifetimes. I think it'll be worse than what we had in '68. I'm deeply concerned. We have Trump that would completely not accept a loss, and the stakes are very high for him. He would face jail. I think we have a lot of Democrats that would not accept a Trump win. The stakes are very high. They believe he is a convicted felon many times over, including for lots of crimes that he hasn't been tried for yet, and that he shouldn't be allowed to stand for the presidency. So I think a large number of the members of the population would not see the elected president as their president. And that is a very serious concern. I see Elon Musk, who is the wealthiest and arguably the most powerful American, certainly in the private sector, is actively weaponizing his social media platform to promote disinformation, including around the election. He just said that civil war was inevitable in the United Kingdom. There is right now nothing being done to even try to constrain the damage that he has the likelihood of doing to this electoral environment. So yeah, I'm very deeply concerned about where we're headed.
How would foreign powers might use this time of uncertainty?
Well, it is a vulnerability to American allies who need a strong and consistent transition, and it's an opportunity for adversaries. I don't think the Chinese would do much because their economy is poor, and they don't want unnecessarily to antagonize and alienate American allies. So they need stability in the global order in a way that most American adversaries don't. But North Korea, Iran, Russia, these are countries that benefit from chaos, and they want the Americans to fail. And I think the potential that they would actually do their damnedest to take advantage of that, both with their own local conflicts and also potentially with asymmetric attacks against the United States and allies, a much more dangerous time.
Thank you, Ian. I hope we can continue this conversation a little closer to the election.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.